Good evening, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Kim Tiha, Director of the Pennington Public Library. And thank you again for joining us tonight for our program titled On Color. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, but a good amount of it actually is. If you have any questions during the program, please write them into the Q&A section, and other comments may be placed into the chat window. At the end of the program, we will have a lovely Q&A session. Now, a little bit about our instructor today, Callie Lasch. Callie Lasch is a museum educator with the Grounds for Sculpture. She studied graphic design at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, art history at the Sorbonne, Paris, and is also classically trained in figurative drawing, painting, and sculpture. Callie is also the founder and co-director of the Institute for Therapeutic Craft and Creativity, an online educational resource dedicated to developing greater awareness of the creative making process and its biological and neurological benefits to whole person health and wellness. Callie routinely integrates these perspectives into the art making activities and team building workshops at the Ground for Sculpture in developing skills for more expansive thinking. And I have a website link that I will post later for everyone to her Institute for Therapeutic Craft and Creativity. So now, welcome, Callie. Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Hello, Callie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
This is great. This is great. So I think Julio here from Grounds for Sculpture will be showing your PowerPoint.
Yes.
Julio, feel free to share. I love the first slide of your PowerPoint, actually. It's just very colorful. Thank you, Callie.
Surely. So shall I just jump on in?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So first, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being here. It's really nice to be partnering with Pennington Public Library as well as your community overall. I also want to say that this is going to be a little bit of a fast-paced experience because we are dealing with color, which is a very deep topic and has been around for a very, very long time. And clearly we don't have that much time tonight to deal with it. But it's a place for us to begin to think about the wonders of color and how they impact our lives, literally every single day in what we do, and even to the extent of the decisions that we make about the things that we do. Julio, I'll just give you the cue then to go to the next slide, if that's okay. So the name of the talk is Color. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, but a good deal of it actually is. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So the big question, of course, is what is color? And before we proceed, I'd just like you to take a moment to really take in what it is that you experience with color in your world on a daily basis, how you may be guided by it, how you may be making choices about which direction to take or how to move yourself through space. I think of traffic lights and double yellow lines, or how you make purchasing choices about clothing, about paint color for your home, or whatever it is. But either way, it's something that comes into play, and it's almost something that we take for granted. So let's go to the next slide. Color actually is light. Without light, we don't have color. And I'm going to get a little bit technical with you as we go through here, but not very much. But it's because I really want you to understand how we got here to where we are today. So color is refracted light that causes white light to separate into distinct spectral colors, that spectrum of the rainbow that we all have known and paid attention to since we were probably kids. Next slide, please. The spectrum was sort of discovered for us by Sir Isaac Newton. It's not so much that he discovered it, but that he took it to a new level. If you could go to the next slide, please. So it was in the 1600s, and it was already sort of known that a prism could produce a spectrum of colored light. But it was Newton that showed us that a second prism could recombine the colors to create white light again. And that was sort of a really big deal. So he did this by demonstrating that the individual colors remained constant when they were shown through the prism. And that was in contrast to the consensus that the prism itself created the colors. Next slide, please. So he also showed us that light is made of particles, not waves, because waves do not travel in a straight line. So just the idea that you could understand that light was made of particles opened up a whole new way of seeing and thinking about what color is. Next slide, please. So he was able to decide to name the colors of the spectrum, and he identified them by likening them to music, the symmetry of the 7 distinct notes from the Western musical scale. And the idea of music is going to come into play throughout this presentation, because it's a way of ordering the things that we were seeing, the things that he was seeing and wanting to show us. He needed to develop a language for it. Thanks, go ahead. So he wrote a book, it's called Optics, right? A treatise of reflections and refractions and inflections and colors of light. Just the idea of the phrase colors of light. That's a beautiful concept in and of itself. The fact that they reflect and refract and inflect into our being, into things that give us back color, is where the science comes in. But just simply the idea that it comes from light is something that's just, I think, in its simplicity, something so beautiful. The idea that he called it optics, I think, is also a really important thing that we're going to talk about going forward. Next slide, please. So Newton is also the one who gave us the color circle. Certainly it's something that we've all seen or played with as kids when we were, learning sort of to play with color. And if you've been an art student, you've definitely played with the color wheel. But his color circle was designed as a tool to show us not just the colors of the spectrum as he had identified them, but how they related to each other, how they relate, how they move from one to another. Next slide, please. And what I find interesting about Newton is the fact that while he was talking color, and while he was talking light, and while he was talking music, he chose to say, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. That's his phrase. We've heard it a lot lately. But the fact is, it was his ode to scientists, astronomers specifically, Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. And I just find it fascinating that this man who was doing this work was also taking in the work of the astronomers. Next slide, please. So give it a think. What is the primary tool that we possess for working with color? Next slide, please. The eye. Our own eyes, obviously, are the primary tool that we have for dealing with color. And after Newton, there was sort of a new take on things. Next slide, please. Thomas Young. Thomas Young came into the sphere of color, so to speak, and he theorized that the eye itself was really important to understanding color, because the eye itself contains different photoreceptor cells, and they're sensitive to light, but they're also limited to different particles of light within that spectrum. That's a lot of information. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to think about. And certainly in the 1800s, early 1800s, it was a lot to try to discover more about. Next slide, please. So along came Hermann Ludwig von Helmholtz, doing my best, and he championed that the retina is actually maximally limited, meaning, of course, that we can only see so many colors through our eyes. Next slide, please. The young Helmholtz theory became what we call and know as the Trichromatic Theory. It's taking the spectrum of colors and reducing them to three quote unquote primary colors. It's how we arrived at the primary colors. But you'll notice that here, the primary colors are different from the ones that we know. Young and Helmholtz describe them as being the blue and the green and the red. We normally say blue, yellow, and red, but we're going to talk about that a little bit more going forward as well. Next slide, please. The trichromatic color theory, according to Young and Helmholtz, again, the larger circles, red, green, and blue. But if you combine them as they are here and look at them as they evolve, you'll start to see the distinction between this light blue, this cyan, the magenta, and the yellow. And of course, those are the colors that we use still very much today as the primary colors that we use in things like mixing paint and mixing packaging, printing materials, and so forth. And of course, the white is in the center because it all emanates from the white light. Next slide, please. The color wheel was really such an invention on its own. And it led us not only to understand the colors and their interplay with each other, but to the idea of color dimension and what happens when color moves from the white light as a source further away from the idea of neutral. And in terms of its chroma, in terms of its depth, in terms of its brightness and its reach into real hue. Next slide, please. So along came a man named Muncell, and he took the color wheel and took it a great deal further. Next slide, please. Albert Henry Muncell was an American painter. He was an art teacher, and he created the Muncell color system. He was born in Boston, and he served on the faculty of what was called then the Massachusetts Normal Art School. It became eventually the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. But he was the one who combined the art and science of color into a singular color theory that we still rely on today. If you have ever heard of Pantone colors, they come from Muncell and his work. Next slide, please. So just like Newton, Muncell also decided that the study of color needed to be similar to the study of music. Music has an order, they were theorizing, so that one can hear how a composition sounds by reading musical notes. One can learn to play or quote unquote mimic or copy that or repeat that musical sound by way of notes and knowing that language. So Muncell wanted us to be able to see color based on its three-dimensional attributes. That, again, what a concept, to see color based on its three-dimensional attributes, not just what it offered us in terms of the spectrum or through the trichromatic limitations of our eyes, but to establish a language and a basis, and let's call them color notes, that we could utilize and rely on and sort of formalize into a language that we can all use. Next slide, please. So the way that we began to understand the value range of color was to reduce it to the neutral value scale. And this provides us with the basis of the rest of what we know about color and its range. But to simplify it, just like the musical scales, the value scale is a system of organizing color. It consists of 9 values or notes that range from white to black, with the variations of gray ranging equidistantly between the white and the black. This is the language of color. Next slide, please. So the value scale applies to the neutral, the black and white, as it does to the other colors. This is very important for knowing when we are painting or trying to mix colors of any kind. It's very important to be able to work with the value scale to sort of measure our work off of the different values that are involved. We're going to talk about that a little bit more going forward. But the idea is that knowing the value scale allows us to create greater depth and three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional surface, specifically when you're talking about painting or drawing. Next slide, please. So what Muncell did is he took the color wheel and sort of, once again, dimensionalized it. He took the color ranges and arranged them in a vertical line with white at the top and black at the bottom, the neutral scale in the center of all things. And if you climb up and down the value scale from there, you will see that colors go lighter or darker in their value, no matter whether it's neutral or no matter whether it's a color of any kind. And then moving out from that center line, you will see that the chroma, the richness of the color, becomes brighter, deeper, and more true to the hues as we know them. So by developing this language and developing it in a decent order that we can read and measure, it allows us to speak to what we're needing to describe, whether as artists or engineers or technicians of any kind, in order to normalize the language of color. Next slide, please. So this is just a different version of it, but it's a dimensionalized version of it, and I think it really helps underscore what we're talking about. The core is the neutrality, the white to black vertical line in the center. The color travels around it. It moves around those neutrals up and down the line. And then the further you go away, the richer the color becomes. Okay, next slide, please. This is a wonderful, this is called the Muncell color tree. And it's a wonderful example of how this can be utilized. I also just think it's very sculptural. And of course, if you've ever gone to buy some kind of paint for your home and you've seen those color chips, this gives you perhaps a sense of how they were derived. Okay, next slide, please. So in 1905, Muncell published a book called A Color Notation on the principles of his system. And in 1915, 10 years later, he published the Muncell Atlas of Color. You can actually go online and look at that book, the Atlas, and you're allowed to open it. I think it's at the Smithsonian, and you're allowed to open the book and peruse the pages. It's just wonderful. Next slide, please. So Muncell, and I like to give him his credit here too, because I think it's really important. He was a teacher and he was, a creator of this color system that's so important. But he was also, in his mind, first and foremost, an artist. And he had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he was in Paris during the Impressionist movement. And while studying in Paris and working in Paris, he won awards for his work in anatomy, perspective, and composition. He was specifically known for his seascapes, which I think is just a lovely, lovely work. Next slide, please. Something else I think is really interesting is Muncell painted a portrait of Helen Keller. And what I find interesting about this is that here was a man who worked to create the theory of color that we're talking about right now, so many years later. And he equated it to music, as so many before him did. But he painted the portrait of a woman who could not see color and could not hear music. But what's interesting is that she understood the value. If you'll go to the next slide, please. She saw color. She wrote about color through association and analogy. And I love her quote, "The only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision." And we're going to talk about that a little later as well. Next slide, please. So in 1918, the Muncell Color Company was formed. And it was formed specifically to produce these color standards. But very sadly, it was also the same year that Muncell passed away. His son took control of the company, and he sponsored studies at the National Bureau of Standards and created the Muncell Color Laboratory. And they continued for a very long time to continue the color scales. Next slide, please. In 1929, they published another book. This one covered 20 hues. It gives you some understanding of the degree to which they were really intensely working on the details of figuring these colors out. In 1950, they went from 20 to 40 hues. And in 1958, they started working with glossy samples, a version of color in a glossy paper. And they needed that because it needed to translate to plastics and other materials with glossy surfaces. They were that meticulous about how to read and see color. So in 1990, they came out with a nearly neutrals collection, which is very important. And that was introduced with just pale colors, which are used in cosmetics, interior design, and computer hardware. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorites. This is Muncell's soil color charts. They were determining the colors of soils. And I find this to be really important because we know also that in looking at the health of the environment, we can tell a lot by the color of the soil. So Muncell's work, really, you know, we talk about it and we think about it, I do anyway, from the perspective of art all the time, but it really has so many more applications. Next slide, please. And then, of course, along came plein air painting and the Impressionists, and a lot of other things changed. Next slide, please. So there's so much here to talk about, and I apologize because I had to be very selective, but my goal was to try to move us through this very deep, rich, extensive history in a way that just sort of punctuated the ways that these folks moved color theory forward. Okay, so what we're dealing with here is William Merritt Chase, and he was one of the initial American Impressionists. He founded the Chase School of Art, which is now known as Parsons. And what's interesting is that he was born in Indiana, and he established a school that was one of the first to actually do outdoor painting classes, which is kind of interesting being post-pandemic and being in this world just today to think that, you know, that was a novel concept in those days. So in the 1870s, his talent was recognized by his wealthy St. Louis collectors, and they arranged for him to go to Europe for 2 years in exchange for his paintings, and also for his expertise in securing European art for their collections. So he went to Europe, and quite frankly, he was never the same, where he met the Impressionist movement. Next slide, please. So he eventually came back to the States. He began teaching private students. He established a summer school in Long Island. It became the first and a very, very popular plein air school specifically. He had about 1,000 students in the late 1890s and early 1900s. But in 1902, he left the school. He wanted to spend his summers in Europe painting. Next slide, please. This is a painting by William Merritt Chase. I will call your attention to also the image on the left of him painting outdoors on Long Island. But you'll notice in his painting that he's working with a lot of primary colors. I think that's just something to note. The Impressionists were also known for sort of using an enhanced color palette to bring out the brightness of things. It wasn't just that they were looking at light and reading it in certain ways, but they were also trying to capture it on, again, a two-dimensional surface and bring it to the eye in a way that resonated in a new way. Next slide, please. So Charles Webster Hawthorne was a student at William Merritt Chase's school. And eventually when Chase left, Hawthorne sort of stepped in and took it over. Next slide, please. He, however, moved it from New York City and took the school concept and brought it to Cape Cod. It became the Cape Cod School of Art. It was the first school to officially teach outdoor figure painting as well. Next slide, please. One of the folks that was influenced by the Cape Cod School of Art was Henry Henchy. And I mention him because he sort of ties a lot of this together. He was born in Germany. He came to Ellis Island. They think around the age of 11 in 1909. At age 17, he was working in the stockyards in Chicago, but he was known for his drawing, and his teachers encouraged him to apply to the Art Institute of Chicago, which he did. He was accepted. He was surprised. And that's where he first became of Charles Webster Hawthorne. Next slide, please. It was because while he was at the Art Institute, his classmates, pretty much his classmates of whom were, had a little bit more resources than he did, they would travel to Provincetown during the summers, and they would study with Hawthorne. They were dealing with a very sort of rigid and regimented program at the Art Institute of Chicago, and these students were coming back with all this bright, bold, airy color work, and Henchy was just absolutely blown away. So he, in 1918, worked his way to the Cape Cod School of Art, and he decided to stay. By 1928, he had become Hawthorne's teaching assistant. Next slide, please. Now, what Henchy did was sort of combined a lot of the things that we've been talking about here so far. He took Isaac Newton's and Muncell's teaching as to the study of color and music, and he brought it into an order in order to approach painting. So he thought that if one can hear how a composition sounds, they should be able to capture that as a visual effect by viewing and practicing the notes and the scales, practicing the notes and the scales in a new way. So his approach to practicing the notes and scales came by way of these things called color blocks. And he insisted that they be done outside in ambient lighting situations and in different lighting situations. And just to give you an example here, what we're looking at in the top left is an example of a color study, a block study at a certain time of day. We can talk about what time of day that is. I'd like you to think about it as I move through them a little bit. So I'm going to tell you first that the idea of working with blocks was the idea of removing any sort of complicated surface. When you work with blocks, you're working with planes, flat surfaces, things that are going to be easier to construct and to see from multiple sides at the same time. So you can compare your color notes as you're thinking about them. So top left, you'll see it has much greater, deeper, richer color hue. You're going to see that the upper right corner is much flatter, we can call it, much more muted in tone. The bottom left is also richer in color, and the bottom right is also more muted. So if you were to apply your thinking, you could say that the, whoop, are we still here?
We're still here, Callie.
Okay, sorry. The slide just went off my screen. Let me see if I can get it back. Well, I'm going to work with it this way. Okay, so the top is the top left, I'm sorry, is a morning study. You can tell by the shadow shapes and the strength of their color. The top right is more of a noon, high noon kind of a study. You can tell because there are really where the shadow shapes are on the other side, the far side, but also because they're very short. And when we are looking at the left, bottom left screen, you're able to see the shadow shapes are once again long, and we can sort of equate that to the long shadows of the evening. And on the bottom right, you'll see that it's almost sort of colorless, more like the grayscale. And that has a lot to do with the fact that color is light, and therefore it is less visible at night. Next slide, please. So why are color block studies so important? Because if you can conquer the color block study, you can apply the same principles to everything else that you're doing. This image here is a plein air study. It's a study of obviously a building and a field, but you'll notice that its approach is very block-like. The surfaces of the barn become surfaces of a cube. The surfaces of the field can be considered rather similarly. If you are looking, and I go back to Helen Keller and her idea of vision, right? We're talking about someone who couldn't see these things, but she understood that unless you know how to see with your eyes how color is wrapping around forms, once you understand that principle, all of a sudden you can start seeing the differences in color and the differences in value and ways to capture them on a two-dimensional surface. Next slide, please. So once you move from the flat cube block study concept, you'll start to begin to notice that those shapes, those colors, those forms can move into other kinds of shapes like cylindrical and or spherical, round, oblong, whatever it is that you can imagine, right? Any shape that's out there, you begin to see the surfaces in ways that show you the shape of color. So Henry Henchy said, see the light, not the object. If you see the light, if you follow that light onto surfaces of a subject, you will begin to see the difference in the range of color, the difference in the values, the difference in the notes. Next slide, please. So, as Henchy also said, every color note has a specific shape. If you are not seeing the shape, you are not seeing the color. Next slide, please. So I just included this. Nobody has to, fuss over this at all, but I'm including this just because I just want to show you that if you're looking for a tool, if you're looking for a way to think about these things on your own, it's a very simple process. You can simply take a piece of foam core or white sort of matte board, make one color of it, any color or multiple colors. I think it might be kind of interesting to do the primary and secondary colors, just saying. But you can score it and you can wrap it around a subject, and and if you put it in different lighting situations, outside, inside, artificial light, darker light, stronger light, whatever it is, cloudy day, at nighttime even, you'll be able to see. It's a good way to practice looking at color simply and the changes, the variations it has through light. Next slide, please. Another tool that you can do is to look at an object and sort of devise in your mind's eye a sort of a wire frame around it. And that will bring it into focus for you in terms of blocks or sort of quadrants that you can then assess different colors by looking at it that way as well. A simple piece of fruit is a wonderful object to use. Next slide, please. Because if you can do this, if you can look at an object and see its variations very, very, very simply, then next slide, you can do this. You can look at something more complex and you can begin to see the various color notes that are being reflected on the surface. So next slide, please. And if you can do the one on the right, you can do the one on the left. It's just another level. It's just another level of study. It's a closer look, a deeper look, a more refined approach. But either way, it starts simply. It starts with a color block study. And then, given your level of interest, you can take it to another level. What I find interesting about these things is all of a sudden you start looking at people across a room or across the park, and you may start to see them in a new light. Okay, next slide, please. So just to finish this out, if you squint, if you remove color from something, you're going to see the simplification of forms. You're going to see the darkest darks, the lightest lights, and any sort of mid-range tones that are involved. But the idea here is that even if you remove the color, you're going to see that the notes remain true. You'll know here in this image that these are trees, these are forms, there are shadow shapes there are different kinds of light happening because the notes are correct. It's like when you're listening to music, and even though you can't play an instrument, or maybe you don't have the greatest voice, you can hear when something is off. It's the same thing, the way our eye is trained when we look at these things. We may not know intellectually, but it resonates. We know when something reads true, when the note is correct. Next slide, please. So if we see the image on the right, the black and white gray value scale, and we now look at the images on the left, you'll see that the colors are they're different. The top left corner has a very violet hue to it. Now, that's not necessarily something that we normally see when we're looking at trees. But this artist chose to go with a very high chromatic treatment of that tree, but it still reads correctly. It registers in our brains properly. Same thing with the image to the right. It's much less muted, much less range of color, but it still reads correctly. And even though the image on the left bottom is more muted in tone and obviously appears to be a sort of a quieter range as well, still reads okay. And on the right lower corner, we have, once again, those shadow shapes that are defined on the surface, and the undertones of the tree are also defined. Next slide, please. So the material of color is a really, really important thing. We're talking about light, we're talking about spectral light, we're talking about capturing that. But what are the materials that we use to do that? Next slide, please. Pigments. So the word pigment actually comes from the word pigmentum, which means a coloring matter, or to paint, a phrase that's used to paint, but it also means to ornament. Next slide, please. The idea of pigments is super, super old from the beginning of time, right? The basic color came from grinding stone and all kinds of other materials and burning wood and so forth and so on. But pigments became materials that we could work with once they were mixed with a binder. And really that's anything that cohesively binds the pigment. The pigment is a powder, and it's anything that brings it into something that we can utilize it for. It could be wax, it could be clay, resin, gum, Arabic, etc. Egg tempera, that kind of thing is, egg yolks can be a binder. The only thing that varies when you're talking about these materials is the binder. The pigments more or less remain the same for a very, very long time. Now, most of the pigments we use are synthetic. Not necessarily, you can use, there are a lot of places you can get a lot of different pigments that are not, which I actually prefer for natural dyeing and so forth. But for the majority, almost everything we do commercially is synthetic. Next slide, please. Cave paintings, right? So the first pigments were a combination of soil, animal fat, burnt charcoal, and chalk. And the first palette consisted of red, yellow, brown, black, and white. Soot was commonly used to make black paint. And ochre, one of my favorites, was an iron-rich rock that gave us the brown tones. Lead, of course, produces whites and grays. But the idea here is that think about how long ago people were playing with, seeing, reaching for color as a way to communicate, as a way to articulate, as a way to develop a language. I just find it to be amazing, so primal. And where did that come from? Next slide, please. So the idea of palettes is a very individualized thing for artists. So I thought we should take a look at some of them because they sort of tell us a lot about the thinking of an artist. Next slide. So John Ruskin, you know, he was a Victorian English art critic and very opinionated. He was also a philosopher and a social thinker and a philanthropist. And he had a lot of very fundamental things to say about art and color. Next slide, please. He says that art is that in which the hand, the head, and the heart of man go together. The hand, the head, and the heart, right? We're speaking a language, we're trying to communicate. We're using the hand as a tool, not our voice, not our words, but we are articulating something in a way that communicates to the heart. So once again, he talked about values, and the whole value of what you are about depends on color. If the color is wrong, everything is wrong. Just as if you are singing and singing a false note, it does not matter how true your words are. Next slide, please. What I think is also important about Ruskin, and important for the time in which he was living, is the fact that he was obsessively interested in many of the things around him, in the world, in nature. And in order to accurately portray these things before the advent of photography as a regularly used tool, artists were sort of tasked with the responsibility of capturing the things that they saw or were looking to communicate about in as true a way as possible. It was really important because it led to other people being able to study them as well. So that meant that you had to sort of capture texture. Remember, again, we're dealing with a two-dimensional surface trying to create a three-dimensionalized form. And so you really had to understand how to turn that form to show its angles and its spherical nature or whatever you were doing. And there are nuances to doing that, which is why that sort of that understanding of the range, the value scale, the Muncell treatment was really important. Next slide, please. Now, we've all become familiar with Van Gogh's work in more ways than he would ever realize. And what was interesting about Van Gogh, I think, because I'm still learning about him, I'm still trying to understand his perspectives. But what I learned in preparing this is that he produced color studies. These were color studies that he was doing. I always thought that he was just really, sort of exaggerating color. But when I realized that he was studying the differences, between opposite colors and complementary colors and so forth, I started to understand a little bit more about him. He was asking which color combinations have the most powerful effect. How many variations are there in a single color? And he, I think, is also fascinating. He used colored wool to test different combinations before trying them with paint. It was expensive, but if he could dye the wool, then he kept those little balls of wool in his art box, and he was able to sort of put them together and look at them and make assessments and then take it further in his paint. As he said, I have made a series of color studies seeking oppositions of blue with orange and red and green and yellow and violet, trying to render intense color and not a gray harmony. That sort of really opened up the world for me with him. Next slide, please. So, ironically, despite the intensity of that color in the painting that we just looked at, this is also Van Gogh's palette. He was also just taken by the softness of hues. And I find this to be fascinating. The Mediterranean has the color of mackerel, changeable, I mean. The Mediterranean has the color of mackerel, changeable, I mean. Wow. So the color of the sea he was equating it to the scales of a fish. We're going to talk a little bit, I can tell you a little bit about animal colors a little later because they take their color in different ways, but it's just fascinating. Okay, so you don't always know if it's green or violet. You can't even say if it's blue because the next moment, the changing reflection has taken on the tint of rose or gray. Think about all of those colors that he was seeing and the way that he tried to capture them on his palette. Next slide, please. So Van Gogh's color awakening came by way of a visit to the Louvre and looking at Delacroix's magnificent ceiling. And that is what created the revelation in his mind about color and how powerful it could be. Next slide, please. I just wanted to put this in the mix because it is the more, it's a longer shot of the ceiling of Delacroix at the Louvre. Really remarkable work. Next slide, please. So this is Delacroix's palette. Very different from the one that we looked at with Van Gogh, very much more subtle, despite the brightness of the colors that inspired Van Gogh on the ceiling in the Louvre. Look how orderly it is. Interesting, just something to note. So Delacroix said, not only can color, which is under fixed laws, be taught like music, but it's easier to learn than drawing. Color is easier to learn than drawing. I can point you to the skin of Venus. I'm sorry, I can paint you the skin of Venus with mud, provided you let me surround it as I will. Okay, next slide, please. Delacroix applied strokes of graduated color. He did not blend them together, but he relied on the eye, right? The eye of the viewer to fuse them or to read them together. He was relying on sort of the tricolor theory, the limitations of our eyes to fill in the gaps of the color. And that is what gave his art a more refreshed feeling in those days. Next slide, please. So the Zorn palette, Anders Zorn. I just want to point out here how muted it is on the bottom of each of those scales and how it gets more rich and chromatic at the top, but it's not the most chromatic you've ever seen. Next slide, please. This is Anders Zorn, a self-portrait. You'll note that it's painted in a very sort of muted palette, although that giant red suit in the center says a lot, but it's not a very bright red suit. Next slide, please. He also, this is a watercolor study, and I just wanted to point out how muted it is overall, but how truly rich it becomes through the use of the shadow shapes and that bolt of color at the bottom in the center. Next slide, please. These are also by Anders Zorn, and the chroma is much richer, but it's also still using the very same palette. I just would like to illustrate here how much range he could get from that limited palette, liken it to how much range we can get with the limitations of our with our vision. Next slide, please. Toulouse-Lautrec, color madness. I mean, he went crazy with it and it worked for him. And I would argue that it's because he understood value, he understood the applications and hit the right notes. Next slide, please. Claude Monet. Monet was looking not just at color and light, but doing the studies as we spoke about, going through the stages of the same subject matter through variations of light. It taught him, it taught us how to capture and how to sort of have a vocabulary a full and wide vocabulary on a very narrow subject. Next slide, please. Once again, Impressionists used the exaggeration of temperature and color in order to create a sort of a more resonant experience with their work. They knew that that combination was a powerful communicator to the receiver, the person looking at the art. The amplification of color just a little bit could create that sensation. Next slide, please. This, believe it or not, is John Singer Sargent. He has amazing work. He has a boatload of wonderful things, but this is a simple watercolor drawing. I'm sorry, watercolor painting. And the idea here is to demonstrate the full range of value that he could get, hitting the right notes with also a high chroma in a watercolor medium. Next slide, please. Van Gogh again. I selected this bill because it has to do with the Van Gogh Cafe at the Grounds for Sculpture. But the idea here is that, once again, Van Gogh was not just experimenting with color, but he was experimenting with application of color. You'll notice the stone, the cobblestone path in the foreground here. He pushed and pulled at different brightly hued colors in order to create those forms, very much like the Japanese woodcuts. But he was playing with chemistry here also, using cadmiums and chromiums and cobalts. Next slide, please. So this is Joaquin Soroya, and even though it's muted, sort of more like Anders Zorn, there's a magnificence to the capturing of the light and the illumination of light with a limited palette. Next slide, please. So George Serra, and he was sort of looked at as a post-impressionist painter. But what's fascinating here is that he devised this technique known as pointillism in order to avoid mixing the color per se but taking it as the natural light was providing it, capturing the play of light and applying it in tiny little dotted strokes that, once again, like Delacroix and like others who were allowing the eye to sort of mesh these colors and move them into filling in the blanks in our vision. Next slide, please. This is Serra's palette. Unbelievably soft, sort of like Anders Zorn in that way, but also very, very powerful. Next slide, please. More modern, Chuck Close. What's happening here is, okay, so Chuck Close is an American painter and photographer, and he is known for his massive scale photorealist portraits. And before we get into the detail of his work, I'll just point out here that on the left, you have a black and white grayscale version. You'll note that the values read correctly. And on the right, you have the color version. And it's very pointillistic, very impressionistic, almost, you could say, Van Gogh-like in the application of paint, in these strokes next to each other that make up the whole. Next slide, please. These are also Chuck Close works. And on the left, you have a black and white photograph. In the center, you have a color photographed. But this on the right is a color study that's capturing cell by cell, pixelated cells in the bold, really extravagant use of placement and color that he achieved here. Next slide, please. The image on the left will show you the scale of Close's work, and the image on the right will show you the detail of his work. once again, the chroma, very, very bold. The idea of this pointillism, but taken to another level. Next slide, please. This is Chuck Close, a self-portrait, but it's the idea here is to show you how he's working off of a grid, and he's constantly using a cellular pixelated approach, even though he's working on this large scale canvas. Next slide, please. I show you this because Brad Pitt is a familiar face, but it's to exemplify the detail and the amazing aptitude. This is in fact a Chuck Close tapestry. It is a woven tapestry. It is woven from a file provided by Chuck Close based on a daguerreotype application that he was trying to achieve. It's phenomenal. When you look at the detail and the scale of this, it's 104 by 78 inches. I believe it says that. I'm having a hard time reading that, but the scale of it and the accuracy is phenomenal. Next slide, please. Just wanted to bring in a little Frank Sinatra because he was not just a musician, but he was also a painter. Frank said that orange is the happiest color. And one of the things that appeals to me about understanding Frank, it goes back to Henry Henchy, because Frank once said that in order for him to sing, he needed to separate the words from the music. He needed to completely remove any sound from the words. He wanted to understand the intent of the language, the intent of the voice of the writer. And then he would add the music. If he felt that the writer, he could speak the words and speak to the true voice, the heart and mind of the writer, then he would add music. So what I found interesting about his paintings is that he separates things. He block studies them. Next slide, please. These are two more of his works. I'm just fascinated by how he takes things apart. He separated, quote unquote, the words from the music in order to rearrange them, to put them back together, to arrange them as he saw they needed to be arranged. Next slide, please. Mark Rothko. Rothko was one of the first to move away from figurative art, and he gave his painting over, as he says, to the power of color, light, and form alone. And he wanted to eliminate anything that interfered with the power of color. The objective was to really look at these in person, to be in front of it, to allow yourself to immerse in it, and to have the viewer experience sort of this radiating, pulsating light that would emanate from within. Next slide, please. Sort of playing on light coming from within rather than without. So this is O'Keeffe. And what I think is fascinating about her work is, in terms of color, is the boldness and the brightness of it, the abstractness of it, but not necessarily so much. It tells us a story in a very simplified way through her expert use of color. And in this piece in particular, you'll notice that she has the color that she selected for the subject matter, the mountain range and the sort of the greenery in the foreground, but the black and white stripe that runs through it and the reflection in the water beyond. Next slide, please. This is O'Keeffe herself, and she said, all the earth colors of the painter's palette are out there in the many miles of the Badlands. I found I could say things with color and shape that I could not say any other way, things I had no words for. Next slide, please. More O'Keeffe. Powerful, simple, direct, speaking almost solely through color. Next slide, please. More modern day sort of approaches to color. This is an experiential installation. This is by an Icelandic artist. It's titled Chromo Sapiens. And it's a space that you literally walk into. Those are fiber pieces that are dyed and mounted around the space so that you are immersed in this true spectrum of color. Next slide, please. More of her work, more of her installation. You can see the scale of her work on the left image, where it's literally covering a doorway, an archway, and up the entire wall of that space. Next slide, please. And then we're going to finish by just looking at the work of this very important man, this very important thinker. Next slide, please. Who taught us to see color. His name is Joseph Albers. And Joseph Albers, he was a German-born American artist and educator. 1888 to 1976 was his lifespan. He taught at the Bauhaus and Black Mountain College, and he eventually later on headed Yale University's Department of Design. He, however, is considered one of the most influential teachers of the visual arts in the 20th century. So I look at him as spanning and giving to us all, no matter where he was. Next slide, please. Albers taught, he was a student at the Bauhaus and eventually taught at the Bauhaus, but then when the Bauhaus was closed by the Nazi regime in 1933, he was brought by Philip Johnson, who was then a young curator at the Museum of Modern Art, to the United States. And Johnson helped secure a position for Albers and his wife, Annie Albers, a weaver, also at the Bauhaus. And they were given a position, they were given positions at the Black Mountain College. Then Albers headed the painting department there, and Annie Albers was doing the weaving there. And eventually they left, and Albers, Joseph went to Yale, but he began to record his approach, his philosophy to seeing color. And it was that took us into and launched us into a whole other way of looking at color. Next slide, please. So what Albers said was that we really have to remove ourselves from formal study in a way that gives that provides limitations, that we needed to look at the characteristics of color in a new way, that we need to look at shape, and we need to look at the way that color interacts and plays with each other. Next slide, please. Albers lived and worked in New Haven, Connecticut with his wife until his death in 1976. And here at the bottom, you'll see a piece of one of Albers' very famous works, and Annie Albers' weaving work next to his. Next slide, please. Ultimately, knowledge and its application is not our final aim. Instead, it is flexible imagination, discovery, invention, and taste. And it's that message that I hope that you will have this evening as a result of this talk. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Callie. That was quite deep, and I learned so much more than I have about color. I think I was talking to you earlier before the program about how I really was involved in art back way in high school. And back then, a lot of the talk about color was more based on the color wheel and this three-dimensional look of color and the tonality, comparing it to music. That this is something that's really new to me. So that's amazing.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Callie? Let's see, I do have a question in terms of clarifying the trichromatic theory.
Please.
Yes, you mentioned that the colors I guess the main three colors were green and was it blue and red?
Red, yes.
And could you elaborate how this is different or the implication of this? Because, it's just been taught so frequently to us since, we were very young that the three primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. So this is something that's completely new to me. I'm trying to wrap my brain around it.
So the three primary colors are called the primary colors because they were established in that trichromatic color theory by the fact that, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Your screen just cut out on me again. Can you still see me?
I can see you. Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk. So it came into being because they became the definition of the limitations of our seeing, that the rods, that our eyes have these cones, these rods, and we can see these three primary colors, but also because these are the three colors that cannot be mixed by any other color. You have the blue, you have the red, and they saw green, but it shifted to yellow over time. It just became an adaptation into yellow. But having said that, those three colors, the three primary colors, are able to mix the secondary colors, which are orange, purple, and what became green. And then from those primary and secondary colors, you can reach every other color that you can imagine. So the primary colors are called the primary colors because that's what we can see, or that's the theory about what we can see. They can't be mixed any other way. And then you can get your secondary colors, and then you're off to the races with anything else you want to do. But without those initial elements, without those primary colors, you're unable to do much more.
Okay.
Does that help you?
Yes, yes. I guess the other thing I remember briefly about how color behaves differently when it's pigment versus light. Does that have anything to do with it as well? Or am I off on that?
Did I hear you say that's different when it's pigment versus light?
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, think about this. I mean, think about the fact that when I talked a little bit about the fact that, when the lights are out, when it's nighttime, tonight, go outside and see how much color you see in the natural world. Like, is that tree looking green to you at night? Or, just take it in and observe, think about it. But today, in today's world, we have, all of these synthetic pigments. And so, you can see color without light today. But even still, if you were to turn out the lights in your home at night, tonight, walk around, take a look. Like, how much color are you really observing? Not knowing what it is, but if you turned off your brain a little bit or went into some place that you didn't know and you looked around, you probably would not be able to tell what color was in the room without the lights.
I will give that a try. Possibly in a room where I don't have a lot of, things in the way that I can hurt myself with. So everyone can try this at home. We do have some questions from our attendees. So from Richard, why do printers use cyan, magenta, etc., instead of primaries?
So over time, we have learned, because we're constantly learning, that for purposes of printing and so forth, the true primary colors for replication are cyan and yellow and magenta. And you can see those, I mean, if you buy a box of anything, at the cookies, and you look at the little side label, you'll see that as the label was being printed, they had those colors noted on the box for printing purposes. But I will also say to you that those are the three primary colors that are now utilized. I talked about the Pantone colors because we are now in a world where having a formal language for color translates into absolutely everything. It's the language that's used to develop computer screens. If you weren't speaking the same language, you couldn't engineer certain things in terms of color, speaking the same language in terms of color. I use Apple Mac products, and when something is processing on my screen, I have the color wheel spinning, and I'm always now, I'm thinking about Muncell and, Newton and all, but here we are in today's day and age, the color wheel and the use of color, how we see and talk about color has everything to do with manufacturing, no matter what it is, clothing or bicycles or anything, in order to paint cars. Stuart Johnson painting sculptures, there has to be a language that we all speak that says the same thing. And the cyan, the yellow, and the magenta help us get to that place.
Wow, fascinating. Anne has a question. Would you say if you follow one of the aforementioned practitioners more than another that you've mentioned?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes. Would you say if you follow one of the aforementioned practitioners more than another?
So I would say I follow all of them pretty equally, because I really feel that everyone contributed. Everyone contributed along the way and has something to share. For example, I definitely abide by Henry Henschy's color block study as a tool in the toolbox when if I'm confused about how to approach something, or I'm stuck when I'm trying to paint something. I will go right back to Henry Henschy's thinking about how to apply the block color approach, color block approach, and I will sort of reduce it to that. But having said that, there's something that everyone has contributed, and I believe that that's what transitions us into the next phase of our own work, is to apply these principles, have them in mind, but to find our own way forward in our own way. Who knows? I mean, that's what everybody else was doing. They were just experimenting. They were asking questions. They were trying to figure things out. And you never know if you might be someone to figure something else out too.
Yes. That's fascinating with all of the history behind these theories. And you hear about music and notes all the time, but you don't hear this about color on a more public way, I guess. So
it would be so wonderful to teach this in schools, to, instead of giving kids, sort of fun things to do. I mean, I'm not saying it shouldn't be fun, but I think that there's a lot more to be learned over time and integrated into the childhood education about art. And I will say this, which I think is also interesting, that that one of the normal school that we talked about, the Massachusetts Normal School, was actually established in order to make sure that drawing and study of art was integrated into children's education at a very early age. And I would say this to you, I know that through the work that I do with Grounds and other places, that the use of color has come into medical schools dramatically as well, for two reasons. Well, the study of art and color, because when you teach medical students to draw, you teach them to slow down their thinking, and they can study the forms of things much more intricately. When you force them to look at it and take a slow stroke and move it around and understand its nuances, just the process, they don't have to become, expert artists, but the process of drawing those things will enable them to see, to have a greater vision. And I did hear from a woman who is a brain surgeon and who had studied the gray scale and the color scale. And what she was talking about was that when she goes in to do brain surgery, she is now able to see different levels of gray matter in the brain and more quickly assess, what does that look right? Is that a little off? Maybe I should look further at this piece here, those kinds of things. So this kind of training, I mean, in this country particularly, we do find, that art is often seen as something sort of as an add-on, an addendum to things. But I am firmly of the belief that it has much to teach us in very, very many ways, and should be applied, I think, to science, the teaching of science as well, because it has a lot to do with science.
Fascinating. Elizabeth has a question. Can you tell us a little more about Joseph Albers' understanding of color and how it differed from the past?
I'm going to do something very unorthodox. I'm going to step away because I want to reach for his book right here. So give
Sure.
me 1 second.
You're not the first to do this. Leave me alone while you reach for a book. I'm not complaining though. So yeah, this is fascinating. Yes, I'm curious too. And I have another question also from Gerda that is very interesting. I'm not forgetting you, Gerda, with your question.
Can you see this?
I can see it. Hopefully everyone else can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to thumb through it. I don't know if I'll be able to do it properly. I'm going to try.
Okay.
I'll just look at
Wow.
the page. I'll try to get a few pages. Okay. Do you see? It's very, very simple. It's very, very simple stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But he forces you to look at color in ways that challenges you to see things. Color juxtaposed in different ways with various hues and values, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also in ways that asks the question about transparency. You know, he's just unbelievable. I'm just going to say, I mean, you can see the influence of his weaving wife in certain ways. And so anyway, is there something specific you would like to know about Albers? Let me show you just this for a second. Do you see this? When you're trying as an artist to create form and the illusion of dimension, one of the things that helps to understand that is these are not transparencies. They may look like they are reflecting transparencies. They're color. It's an application of color.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the mind, the additive and subtractive use of color is just amazing. I'll tell you just one more thing about Joseph Albers. I'll read it. Okay. So the aim of such color study is to develop an eye for color, right? Seeing color action, as well as feeling color relatedness. It's about observation and articulation. Practice before theory. This is the other thing that he did. We've talked a lot about color theory. This whole thing is about color theory. Albers doesn't say throw out color theory, but he is saying know the color theory, know it in your bones, but put it aside and play with color, because by first playing with that essence of color coming into your mind and into your heart and into your hands and so forth, then when you go to find the theory, you'll have a relationship to the color and you'll have a better sense for it, for the lessons that theory teaches us.
Yeah, it's when you were showing pictures from his book, I'm just reminded of seeing Rothko in person.
Yes.
How you just don't have the same experience with it unless you see the scale of it and experience it in person. The replication is in a book is just not the same.
It's not. I almost not want to do that. You know, it's almost offensive. But
to see something of a grand scale and the color and be immersed in it. And to feel its vibration. I mean, I think that's the power of color. Yeah, that's wonderful. Oh, Gerda, I did not forget you, Gerda. Gerda has a question, which I don't even know if I can pronounce this word, but I looked it up. What causes metamerism, which is a phenomenon where the color of two objects appear the same under a particular light source?
So true. I don't know the answer to that question at this moment, but let me think about that for a second. Repeat the question again.
So she's wondering what causes this phenomenon. It's called metamerism, and it's a phenomenon where the color of two objects appear the same under a particular light source. And I'm assuming the colors of these two objects are actually not the same, but they appear to be the same.
Yes, and Albers actually has an exercise that he has. I don't know the answer to that scientifically, but I can tell you that Albers actually has an exercise where he encourages one to do just that, where you take different colors. It's really simple. You take different colors of construction paper and you cut them into squares or whatever kind of shapes that you like, and you arrange them onto different colors of paper, and you assess whether it is or is not the same color in the same light. Okay. So once again, it's a sort of roundabout way of understanding the dimensionality of color and the relatedness of color. So I don't have an answer specifically, but I can tell you that it's a wonderful exercise to play with.
It reminds me of that meme, the black and blue dress versus the white and gold dress. I don't know if anyone else remembers this. It was a photo that was released on the internet, and no one could decide or agree on what color this dress was. For some people, what they looked at, it looked like it was black and blue. And other people looked at it and it looked like it was gold and white.
Really?
Yeah.
So can I tell you just something about iridescence? Because I think this
Yeah.
is, maybe it has something to do with this. I'm not quite sure. But so pink is the oldest known color produced by a living organism. And they discovered it in cyanobacteria fossils.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Cyanobacteria, which is weird because it's actually blue-green algae. So how it got to pink, whatever. But you know, what Van Gogh said about, you know, seeing the color of the mackerel in the scales, right?
Mhm.
So what we learned is that scientists don't quite know how animals such as peacocks and butterflies, chameleons and so forth change their colors. They know that they do, but they don't know how they make those colors. So what they're learning is that there are these minuscule features on feathers and scales and hair and skin, and I would argue maybe even on some fabrics, who knows, that will change the way a color appears. It gives it an essence of iridescence because it's actually dealing with a transparent surface, and it filters the light through different wavelengths. And what you see is these colors blending in the eye at different angles on a transparent surface and absorbing different wavelengths of them. It goes right back to the spectrum, Newton's spectrum, right? But it's on different surfaces. So whereas in the old days, 1600s, they thought that this prism created the spectral light, it wasn't. It was the light going through, which is the same thing now on feathers and scales and so forth. Maybe, I don't know. There's also kinds of wonderful things happening with fabric. So who knows?
Yeah. Anne has a question. What do you think of Ad Reinhardt and Agnes Martin? I'm not sure if I know these people. Maybe you do.
Agnes Martin, I do. I was going to include her here. I did not, though, because I had so little time.
Yeah.
And I think she was I think she was groundbreaking and doesn't get the credit she deserves. And I thought about that a lot in coming into this presentation. And I was actually going to say that one of the things I would really, really like to do is do a talk about women and color, women in art and color, women in science and color. I have a boatload of stuff I'd love to share on that alone.
Wow. We did have several people ask what other courses you teach, and you know what else you speak about. And I know that you've done a more extensive course, like a 4-week course on color for the grounds for sculpture, right?
This talk actually came out of a class that Julio proposed and we did together for Grounds for Sculpture. It was a 6-week class on color in which we did a talk each week and activities and exercises, many of them based on the artists and the scientists that we talked about here tonight. I would say to you that Grounds for Sculpture is an amazing, amazing, amazing resource for things like this. They have had the foresight and devoted the space and the time to creating programming that is, I would say, really breakthrough in its approach to understanding how arts can be used as a tool, like we talked about earlier, for more expansive thinking, and that applies to almost anything else you would like to do, whether it's in your professional life, your personal life, your artistic life, whatever it is. You know, it all comes from how we take in information and how we articulate information, and through creativity and working with our hands and working with slow looking processes, art can provide a tool to open the brain and open the mind to different ways of seeing, and different ways of seeing translates into how we approach the perspectives of our lives. So it's an amazingly wonderful, useful process. And I would highly encourage folks to look at the program at Grounds for Sculpture, come visit us. Maybe we can do some in partnership with you as well. and sort of take on some new challenges. We're at a new breakthrough point in our world right now, and ways of seeing new things. So why not learn some new tools?
That was wonderful. I hope it inspires everyone to check out Grounds for Sculpture. And, I bet I'll be having a lot of requests for you to have a reprise of your 6-week course after this, I'm sure. I'll pass those along to you, but I'm getting a sense that I will. Before we go today, I hope you don't mind if I'm just going to promote a few library programs. And one is actually, we were telling you and Julio beforehand about how we have an arts educator who speaks about art history and great artists, and she's been very popular. She's coming back next week, Wednesday, June 30th at 7 p.m. via Zoom to speak about Ruth Asawa, who is an American sculptor, educator, and arts activist, who is known for her extensive body of work, including paintings, printmaking, public commissions, but especially her wire sculptures that challenge the conventional notions of material and form. So that's next Wednesday, June 30th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. And then this Friday, we have a return of the Eyes of the Wild Zoom Zoo to our library to kick off our summer reading. This is Friday, June 25th at 4:15, and they are just delightful. They bring animals and education about these animals. Before COVID, they brought these animals to our physical space, and for the past year, they've been bringing these animals to us via Zoom. So if I would say we started it off for families, but even if you're an adult, you would really enjoy these presentations because they're fun, but they're very informative about these animals. And my favorite animal is going to be here on Friday, the prehensile-tailed porcupine. So, so yes, please join us. And Callie, Julio, I really look forward to collaborating with both of you again. I mean, this has just been so informative and fun. So
thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So everyone, have a wonderful evening. And until the next time on Zoom, I'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.